So this might be a little hard to believe, but this drum set, made out of components from the early 1990s, adjusted for inflation, would cost more than every electronic drum set on the market today. It's more expensive than everything from ATV, from Gava, from Roland, and even from Drumtech. So today we're taking a look back at a drum set I only briefly mentioned in my History of Electronic Drums documentary, the DDRUM AT. A huge shout out to a subscriber named Sam who donated this drum set to the channel, making this video possible. So here's a quick overview of this particular setup. We've got a DDRUM AT module, 4 DDRUM 3 precision pads, 2 DDRUM kick drum towers, an S&S Industries snare, and then finally 2 DDRUM bar triggers. Now, I'm using acoustic cymbals because that's what everyone used in this era of electronic drums. Also because the DDRUM AT doesn't include any cymbal sounds at all. Just take a look at any footage of Def Leppard and you'll see a similar combination. Wait a minute, are those drums even plugged in? I feel lied to. Now, unlike the DDRUM 2, which came before, this module was specifically advertised towards acoustic drummers that wanted electronic drum sound reinforcement via triggers. But they sold this drum set in 2 configurations, with pads or with triggers, so what I'm using is also correct too. They weren't the first to make electronic drums, but I'd say they jumped into the industry around halfway through the first hype bubble. The Digital Percussion Plate 1 in 1983 was their first product, followed by the Clavia DDRUM rack system in 1985, the DDRUM 2 in 1988, and now the DDRUM AT in 1993. By the way, I definitely know I'm skipping over lots of other products they came out with. If you'd like to learn more about this, here's an excellent book you can check out, which I'll link in the description below, which covers everything they released in the 1980s. From what I hear, only a couple hundred of these modules were ever made, so it's fairly rare. The DDRUM AT, the first thing you need to know about it is that it's enormous. Here it is next to my Roland TD30, which is also a large module for scale. Electronics back then just took up a lot more space, and that's why the casing had to be this large. So the AT in the name stands for acoustic trigger. This module was pushed as a hybrid drum module of sorts. Think of it as an older version of a Roland TM6. This module came out about a year after DDRUM's new line of acoustic drum triggers. And by the way, they look nearly identical to the modern ones that are still being sold today. Now, those triggers were a breath of fresh air to a lot of drummers who were used to having to tape down piezos directly onto acoustic drum heads. This is a 16-note polyphony module, and for a module this large, it has a shockingly low number of sounds built in. As far as I could tell, there were only 64 samples inside of this entire module, and there are no cymbal sounds by design because you're supposed to be using this with acoustic cymbals. But thankfully, there's also an entire ecosystem of extra sounds you had access to if you wanted to cough up even more money. DDRUM sold these things called sound packs to expand your module. I'd rather be a sound pack. These cartridges were introduced with the DDRUM 2 module and were fully compatible with the DDRUM AT. I tried to buy some of these on eBay or Reverb.com for this video, but unfortunately I couldn't track them down. Vintage DDRUM gear is actually kind of rare and hard to get your hands on unless you're on the internet at the right time. And of course, this module also has MIDI, so I'm guessing some people bought this just to use it as a trigger interface, and they got their sounds elsewhere. But that's kind of hard to imagine, because this module costs twice as much as the TD50X. Now, as far as editing parameters, you got controls for nearly everything. There's no menu system to get lost in because basically everything had its own control. You have bass and treble EQ controls, panning, pitch controls, bend and bend time controls, and decay. Believe it or not, this module also let you layer sounds too. You had to sacrifice one of your pad inputs, but once you do that, you can do all sorts of things. And for some reason, they also have individual sensitivity controls on every single input. Now, you might be wondering about the fact that you're recording acoustic cymbals, and the mics are also picking up you whacking on these electronic drum pads too. Is this a big deal, and does it sound annoying? So yeah, it's definitely there, but as you add in more module audio, the acoustic hits are partially hidden by the drum module drum hits on top of it. To me, it kind of fades into the background. I'll still hear it if I go looking for it though. On the back of the module, the DDRUM AT has 8 1/4-inch inputs for your drum pads or triggers. The module features 8 direct outs, right and left master outs, 5-pin MIDI in and out, a line input, and then finally a remote connection. Now the tricky thing about trying to put together a vintage drum set is that they use very specific cables. So if you get one of these, you're going to have to buy 8 1/4" to female XLR cables. And those are not really something everyone uses. I just accidentally happen to have 2 of them already because I purchased the wrong kind of cable a year ago, so I had to buy a few more to put this set together. There's a lot more going on inside of this module. There's manuals you can read if you want to go into all the nerdy details, but that's like a quick overview. So what I've got here are 4 DDRUM 3 precision pads. Technically, the module doesn't initially ship with these pads because they are from the generation right after the AT, but I'm guessing that the DDRUM AT was still being produced while the DDRUM 3 pads were still being made as well, so they could have been sold together. And I would not be surprised if they're nearly identical to the DDRUM 2 pads, but with some cosmetic changes. The tom pads are 1 zone, and they feel pretty soft when you hit the center of the pad. After opening up the head, it looks like there's this star-shaped cut in the middle of the center foam dampening, and that gives you a little bit more give. If you remove the foam and then turn it over, you'll see that what you're hitting is foam and then a metal plate, and then a bunch of little foam feet on the bottom of it. The trigger is a standard piezo just like what we're using today. If you flip the pad over and then remove the bottom shell, you'll see that a wooden plate is what makes up the frame of this pad. Now the manual says that the snare has 2 zones. When you plug in a stereo cable into input 2 for the snare, the module automatically chains together input 2 and 3 together for dedicated rim and head zones. No extra cable is needed. But unfortunately, you are still taking up 2 inputs. But as you've probably noticed, I'm not using the DDRUM snare as a snare in this drum set, so the setup is slightly different. So this is the S&S Industries XL Stinger pad. It's obviously not made by DDRUM, and it's got 2 zones using 1/4" cables instead of 1 XLR cable. I was really thankful for this because it meant I didn't have to purchase even more specialty cables for this drum set. This particular pad has a firmer feel than the DDRUM 3 precision pads. It's hard to pin down an exact year, but judging from when the advertisement photos began popping up in magazines for its smaller 10-inch brother, the XL probably came out somewhere around 1994. So I mounted this on a snare stand, as you can see, but it was more meant for a drum rack. You can tell because there's this giant metal casing that makes it difficult to put on a snare stand with 2 cables plugged in, because it keeps bumping into the arms of the snare stand unless you position it just right. Now odds are you've probably never heard of S&S Industries and might be wondering what happened to them. So from what I can tell, Pintech bought them in the late 90s or very early 2000s. I don't know an exact date. And that's why some older Pintech drums look very similar to S&S. Next up are the 2 kick drum pads. It's a strange design, to be honest, kind of like a giant letter L that's leaning in. You have to connect your kick drum pedal to this metal bar right here, and your pedal sits on top of this very large flat plate. I believe that's there for stability. These kick drums are freaking heavy. It is solid metal. But I do believe I'm missing some floor spikes because, despite the weight, my kick drum was sliding all over the place when I was playing on this. But they do have a very surprisingly solid feel to them. You have to use felt beaters though, because they are incredibly loud unless you're using felt. The playing surface is a very thin slab of rubber covering a metal plate, which is sitting on a foam pad. And if you think 2 kick drum towers is a bit much, take a look at this advertisement from DDRUM and it's 6 kick drums. This guy would need almost an entire module just for the kick drums alone. And while we're on the topic of electronic drum advertisements, take a look at this promotional kit DDRUM had. Words just do not do this thing justice. They kept this thing going, sort of changed it around and adjusted what components were there. Here's a version with the DDRUM 3 module, and you might be wondering who on earth would be caught playing this thing. And then there's the DDRUM tube. They were originally released in 1989, and I've got 2 of them here. Well, I do like the concept of a bar trigger, and they really do work and don't take up that much space. They're very handy in that way. The thing is, it's just a little bit weird hitting a solid piece of metal. Now at some point, DDRUM stopped making these. Maybe it was like the late 90s or something like that. But then in 2016, they brought them back with the original design. Checking back a few years later, they're gone again. Okay, so now that I've covered all the pads, you might be wondering how much all of this cost. There were 2 versions of the DDRUM AT. The 5-pad drum version was $6,650. And if you were strictly an acoustic drum guy and only wanted the module and 5 drum triggers, that would cost you $5,350. This all seems a bit expensive for what they're offering here, but wait until you adjust it for inflation. Today, that would cost $10,107 or $12,500 respectively. And remember, you still have to buy the cymbals. Those aren't included, and you're probably going to be using acoustic ones. You're probably going to be wanting to buy a few sound packs, so the price just keeps going up and up and up. Alright, so if $12,000 is the pricing for a stock drum set that only comes with a kick, snare, and toms, and then the module, what about the setup that I have right here with the extra components? Well, that's a little bit more complicated, and I'm going to have to give you an estimated price because I am missing some bits of data. Here's a wall of text on screen that explains my exact reasoning, but the price I came to for this drum set is $7,550. Adjusted for inflation, that is $14,073. So unfortunately, high electronic drum prices are not new by any stretch of the imagination. Now, of course, this drum set is not worth nearly that much money anymore. It depends on the market and what people are willing to pay. The module by itself currently is being sold for about $500. Just shipping this thing is very expensive though. I think I paid like $150 or $130 just for the shipping because of how heavy everything is and how large the components are. So what is the legacy of the DDRUM AT? Believe it or not, the AT was incredibly high-end for the time. There were competitors, but this drum set had a polished feel, great triggering, and some frankly advanced layering options that many mid-tier modules today don't even have. And the build quality of everything is fantastic. But to be honest, the AT is more of a footnote in electronic drum history than anything, mostly because its successors cast such a large shadow. When people think about DDRUM electronics in the 1990s, they don't think of the AT, they think of the DDRUM 3 and the DDRUM 4, which came after it. While this drum set is largely forgotten now, I think it's interesting to take a look back at drum sets like this and find out what makes them special and unique. Have an awesome day, and I'll see you all in a few.